Please take a moment to silence all your electronic devices. This event is being video recorded. Thank you. Esteemed guests, the program is about to begin. Thank you. Please welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I want to thank everybody for being here today to celebrate Mike's life, and want to begin by recognizing Mike's spouse, Pat, who is here, and the family members, Elizabeth Sovern, Raymond Conley, son-in-law, Jeff Sovern, the grandchildren, Melanie and Jesse, and Jane Sovern, the niece. Our moderator, George Hiltzik, and the panelists, Rolando Acosta, Hal Edgar, Jane Ginsburg cannot be with us, Jillian Lester, and Jerry Speier. I just have a few things to say about Mike before turning it over to the panel. Mike was one of the most talented people I have ever encountered in life. I don't use the term brilliant very often, but it was the word that came to my mind whenever I had a conversation or discussion with him. From the moment I was a student in his class on labor law, to the times when I would see him at trustee meetings towards the end of his life. He impressed me again and again with his insights, his fresh humor, his laugh, and his goodwill. He was very quick-minded. Nothing seemed to be beyond his comprehension. He had a great intellectual mind, one befitting a law professor to be sure, but his range was dazzling. It seemed as if he could do anything, because he could. In leadership, in administration, in business, politics, conflict resolution, arts and culture. He just moved across human pursuits as if he had an endless reservoir of capacities to draw on for whatever he might be called upon to do. For all his sophistication, he was the most Columbia of any Columbians. A call I will never forget is the one where he asked me, as president, whether I would permit his ashes to be placed in St. Paul's Chapel. It would mean the world to him, he said, having spent nearly his entire life in the university. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe he was asking me. I couldn't believe I actually had the power to make such a decision. But I figured if Mike thinks it's okay to ask for this, then it must be okay to do. And it all seemed to me so right in a poetic sense of making Mike and the university eternally connected in this physical way. So I said, of course. As president, Mike saved Columbia. The deep disruptions of the late 60s and then the terrible decade of the city in the 70s brought Columbia to its knees. What incredible good fortune the institution had to have someone of Mike's gifts to begin to bring it back. All that I have tried to do in my time has been to build on the foundation to bring the university back to being worthy of the talents and the lifetime dedication of a Mike Sovern. Mike has figured in my life in so many ways it's hard even for me to recount or account for them. How many times when teaching do I take a turn in the Socratic questioning that bears a resemblance to how Mike conducted his classes? Many is the answer. How many times when making a decision in my current role have I wondered how Mike would decide it? Again, many is the answer. I could go on. The point is that a great mind and a great person like Mike lives with us throughout our days and helps shape us in ways unknowable. Pat, you were a joint and equal partner in the adventures of Mike's extraordinary life. We know this has been the hardest of losses for all of the family and members. And Jean and I and everyone extend our deepest condolences and love. Thank you.
It's never good to follow a brilliant speaker, but I'm going to try. G.G. Michelson, chair of the Board of Trustees, when Mike left the presidency, spoke and said that he was one of the richest, most extraordinary people who led Columbia in its 218 years. He was extraordinary. And today, obviously, we have very special individuals who shared Mike as a colleague and friend. And I thought I would try to highlight some of Mike's achievements, as hard as that could be. But first, I think we should all thank Mark Rudd, and let me explain. Some of you may know him as the person who led the riots in 1968, which happened to be my first year of law school. And I was living in John Jay Hall at the time, and I was grateful because I just met my wife, so when school was out for 2 weeks, we had a good vacation. But that conflict absolutely served, ironically, as the catalyst to jumpstart Mike's career as he headed the commission to study the causes and impact of these events. He did such an extraordinary job that it often said, "I discovered my taste for administration," which he did, and that really prompted him to forge his career. So I'm going to summarize some of his major accomplishments. Obviously, Dean of the Law School, Provost of the University, then President. He raised more money than any previous president, more than doubling the endowment to over $1.8 billion, which in those days meant something. He was a fearless protector and advocate for free speech. And at a memorable historical moment, he invited Salman Rushdie to campus after Ayatollah Khomeini ordered Rushdie's execution, which of course generated worldwide coverage. Mike stood tall, didn't bow to the pressures. Salman spoke, and Mike's answer to hate speech, and I quote, "More speech, not more hate." And again, that captured Mike's view of the world. He was in the forefront of diversity and inclusion. He directed a major gift of $60 million in the 80s solely for minority scholarships at the college. He hired the first female faculty member at the law school, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Kellis Parker, the first African-American faculty member. Under his leadership, Columbia College became co-ed without undermining Barnard College across the street. And one of our many dinners with Mike, I asked him, looking back, what would you say were your two greatest accomplishments? And right away he said admitting women to the college. He said it just elevated everything about the college. He kept the core curriculum, and he viewed that as a tremendous, tremendous opportunity and growth for the university. He engineered the sale of Rockefeller Center, and obviously more about that later. He was ahead of his time by establishing the Harriman Institute for Training and Research on Russia, the former Soviet Union. He added 120 endowed chairs in fields ranging from Japanese law to electrochemistry. I could go on, but our panelists will also mention some of Mike's greatest achievements. As we all know, and as President Bolger pointed out, Mike had a great sense of humor. When asked about, somebody had the temerity to ask him about his failures or lapses as president, he said, and I quote, "I'm very kind to myself. I tend to forget my mistakes." And that's just such a typical Mike quote. Finally, and look, I could go on for hours, but I got to be respectful. So finally, Mike said, in one of my favorite quotes, he said, "I would like to be judged not simply by what I achieved at Columbia, but where I stood on the larger issues of our time." And that, I think, really captures who Mike is. What an incredible, iconic visionary. And now I'd like to start the program. And our first speaker is going to be the Honorable Rolando Acosta. He's the presiding justice of the New York State Supreme Court. He was a dear friend of Mike's, proud graduate of the college and Columbia Law School. And I did a lot of research, and a fun fact that Judge Acosta holds the record for the most career wins and complete games in the history of Ivy League baseball. So when Mike gave Joe DiMaggio an honorary degree, and when Mike threw out the first pitch at Yankee Stadium, he still could never hit Rolando's fastball. And so he tried, but he couldn't do it. Rolando, it's all yours.
First of all, thank you so much, Pat, for the privilege of participating in this celebration of Mike Sovern. As you've heard, many will highlight what a great professor or university president Mike was. Others will focus on his incredible talent as a labor lawyer, I think we all know that about him. I simply want to highlight what a larger-than-life figure Mike was to many of us, and what a great friend and mentor he was. I miss my conversations with Mike, including about how two South Bronx kids from different generations made it out, and as he says, did okay. Of course, Mike didn't care that, as Pat will point out to him, that my South Bronx was a little different from his. You see, Mike was simply being empathetic Mike, which I always found fascinating, and always making me feel as if I were his pal. So my wife and I will have dinner on Arthur Avenue with Mike, Pat, Leo Melonas, who I see in the audience, and his wife, Helen. This is something that we try to do a couple of times a year, as clearly we're all foodies with a strong interest in fine wine and a great conversation. It was always a great time with Mike. It felt like I was having dinner with the president. I have never received better treatment and adulation than when I hung out with Mike, especially in the Bronx. There was always Yankees banter, including how I only got to play at Yankee Stadium, but did not get to throw the first ball as Mike had. I kept asking Mike whether his pitch was a strike in the tradition of those Colombians who play Yankee stadiums, like Lou Gehrig, for example. All I got from him was, Riley, that pitch was a beauty, and the Iron Horse would have been proud, referring obviously to Lou Gehrig. And there were deeper conversations. Mike, indeed, and I think Lee pointed this out, he was the smartest guy in the room, always, which inevitably turned to Colombia, the love of Mike's life for over 60 years. Sometimes we had lighter conversations about our children. I remember telling Mike how disappointed I was that my daughter Zila did not end up in his legal methods class because her last name began with a wrong letter. Indeed, I blamed the catastrophe on why Zila wound up at Goldman and later at Devervoice, rather than as a public interest lawyer like her dad. Mike's response was typical Mike. Rolando, you're kidding yourself. Zila had the privilege of doing all of those wonderful things, including being articles editors for the law review like me, he says. And she did all of those things because she had Vasti's genes. So Vasti, my wife. So Mike was a presence at Columbia activities, including at trustees meetings, as Lee pointed out. It was fascinating to have coffee with Mike on a Saturday morning before a trustees meeting and listen to stories of his 60 years love affair with Columbia, from his college and law school days to his role in preserving knee-blind admission to keep the doors open for kids like us, he said, who did not have the means to attend college. He also spoke of advocating for the admission of women, as George pointed out, to the college, which amazingly did not occur until the early 80s, partly due to concern about the impact on Barnard College. As Mike explained, the consensus was that the absence of women had diminished the quality of life at Columbia. As Lee Bollinger often says, Columbia is the place that Mike saved. I think it is clear that Mike saved Columbia from more than just financial troubles. His vision encompassed an understanding that history will harshly judge an institution that sought to be great but failed to be inclusive. As law school dean, he presciently recruited Ruth Bader Ginsburg as his first woman law professor and Kellis Parker as his first black law professor. Kellis was really a breath of fresh air for us law students of color during those difficult and somewhat oppressive 80s. And it is difficult, obviously, to overstate how impactful RBG was on the status of women in the law and society. But I remember telling Mike that his most impactful hire to me personally was Harriet Rabb. Harriet Rabb, who revived clinical programs at the law school. Her immigration clinic gave me the opportunity to personally test our justice system, which was unjustly excluding Haitian immigrants from the U.S. without as much as a hearing, simply for being caught on the water mere feet away from American soil. Thank you, Mike, for being such a great leader and such a wonderful friend. I missed our conversations.
To introduce Al Edgar, who's student, colleague, and has rich experiences with Mike that he'd like to relate to us.
Thank you. Pardon me, I've been... And thank you, Pat, for asking me to participate in this. It's a great privilege to do so. My last extended conversation with Mike was here at Faculty House upstairs in the luncheon room. He had sent me the manuscript of his book, Improbable Life, and asked if I would look over what he had said about the Tuskegee syphilis suit, on which I had worked with him. In fact, I had, as I read it, one minor editorial suggestion to make, but he had asked me to have lunch, and so, of course, I accepted. To have lunch, to be invited to have an hour or so of Mike's time, was like scoring a reservation at a fancy 3-star French restaurant, where for days in advance you'd anticipate it, even though you had no idea for sure of what was going to be on the menu. So we ate and we talked about Tuskegee for no more than 5 minutes, I'd guess. And then for the next hour and a half, Mike told great stories about all the interesting things he had done, no doubt fresh in his mind as a result of writing the book, but stories about selling Rockefeller Center, about his work co-educating Columbia University, about his work on Broadway with the Schubert Theaters, about saving Sotheby's, the auction house, about his work on the Pfizer board, taking over Warner Lambert and getting full control of Lipitor, a very useful drug, with AT&T, his extraordinary role that he'd been talked into serving as an arbitrator for a very wealthy family. Whenever disputes arose amongst the family members, they submitted him to Michael as their standing consigliere, and it was a role that both interested him and, I must say, amused him a bit that he was doing this. All these stories were told with extraordinary wit. He had great stories, and he was just the best company in the world. And I'm sure that a major part of his success is attributable to the fact that he was the best company in the world. Brilliant, funny, full of wisdom. So let me say that I interacted with Mike as his student in evidence. I was a member of his faculty. I was his delegate and nominee to supervise, and very nominally supervise, the work of the Social Welfare Center in Law, one of the 4 OEO backup centers funded by the Office of Economic Opportunity in the 60s and early 70s that brought many of the important welfare rights cases of that era. After that, I was with Mike as his litigation assistant in the 2 big litigations of his career, and so far as I know, the only ones where he had headline responsibility, the Tuskegee syphilis suit and his role as counsel for New Jersey in the Contracts Clause case, United States Trust Company versus New Jersey. And finally, I saw him from time to time during his university presidency, particularly in connection with his establishing a committee to oversee and give recommendations about the university's responsibility in licensing university technology developed with federal grants, and as well faculty participation in startups that grew out of those research projects. A new world opened up for the university as a result of the Bayh-Dole Act, and an area where Columbia excelled then and has continued to be an extraordinarily successful university. So despite all these contexts, I can't claim to have been a close personal friend of Mike's. Instead, I was an awed observer of what he did. So let me offer a few observations about Mike, both in his role as dean, and then a little bit about the Tuskegee syphilis suit, and more about that later, George, if you'd like. When Mike became dean at Columbia, the law school was very much smaller than it is today. Our entire enrollment, counting graduate programs, was under 1,000 students. We did everything in one building. We use parts of 4 now. I tried to find the exact number of faculty, but I think it was about 50, and all were tenure track. We had no separate clinical program at that time. The administration fit into a corner, a small corner of the 7th floor, and I think the entire administration, Dean Lester, was a mere 15 people, as I tried to count them. The dean, Michael, 4 assistant deans, and their assistants and secretaries. The university was in such desperate financial straits that it imposed a hiring freeze, so that if one of Mike's personnel moved on, he could not replace that person. And I have never seen Mike angrier, and he was never really angry, but more frustrated, may I say, with the proposition that he couldn't hire somebody when someone moved on, and that rather than being given a budget within which to work, he was micromanaged. And I gather he took that lesson with him when he became university president, in that he did not micromanage the deans and institutions that reported to them. He gave them broad discretion to carry on and do the job. In addition to being small, maybe it was because we were small, the law school was run basically as a committee of the whole. The faculty was in charge of the institution in a way that no longer obtains, given that most of the work is done through committees. In those days, 5-hour faculty meetings were not usual, but they were not an uncommon event. As the faculty dealt with controversial issues rising out of the student rebellion and other issues, including, of course, faculty hiring. And there were great debates, and as you can imagine, a law faculty is filled with people who like to debate. And when we say, and I said it often, that Mike hired Kellis Parker and Ruth Ginsburg, it really isn't true. The faculty hired them. Mike didn't. And yet, it made me all the more impressed with Mike's leadership capacities, because I may have been too junior to know the backroom machinations that had gone on, but Mike never took the lead in faculty discussions. He listened to what everybody had to say, and it was often a lot. And then he made his interventions at the end. And he was rather like a skilled dressage rider on a horse, in that he moved the animal in the way that he wanted it to move, and he got the results. And so far as I know, all the results that he sought. And in particular, as mentioned, the establishment of an independent clinical law program, a superb one, in which students and faculty would represent live clients in controversial cases, cases in which the law school itself might get pressured as a result of stances that were being taken in litigation. And Mike was more than willing to have that happen, and he supported his faculty completely in his role as a dean. While the faculty appointed people, it was the dean's responsibility to recruit them. And Mike was a master at doing that. In particular, I recall the case of Ruth Ginsburg. We knew, or at least we knew through back channels, that she either had an offer from Harvard Law School or was about to get one. And it was Mike's job to persuade her to forget about Cambridge. Why in the world would you go there and come to Columbia instead? And I can recall the way Mike always reacted when a colleague came with an alternative offer. I can hear him saying it now, "You don't want to do that." And he'd say, "You don't want to do that," and then give 12 reasons why New York was the best place in the world to be, which was true, and he believed it. And then, of course, Ruth's case, Marty, our later colleague, Ruth's husband, had his law practice in New York, and Jane was in school, et cetera. In any event, we managed to land Ruth, but in an unusual way, in that she came to the faculty with a commitment to doing litigation work outside the institution. So it was a professorship understanding that a significant amount of time was going to be spent outside the halls of academia. And as pointed out, it worked out very well, both for her and for the institution. Let me turn to Tuskegee for a bit, and I'll say more later if you'd like, George. But Mike got into the case because Fred Gray asked Jack Greenberg for help. Fred Gray was Martin Luther King's lawyer, one of them at least, one of that amazing band of courageous African-American lawyers who anchored the civil rights movement in the South when you could get killed for doing it. But in any event, Fred had a thriving law practice in Tuskegee and represented the participants in the study. He had come to New York, Fred had, in an effort to get help from New York law firms in maintaining the case, and he'd been turned down by several of them. I never heard why he had been turned down. My supposition was either they thought the case unwinnable, which was a fair assessment of it, inasmuch as it was one of the first mass tort class actions ever brought. They may have thought that the damages, even if liability was established, would be de minimis, in that the case had to be brought under the Federal Tort Claims Act, and that act precluded punitive damages against the government. And in states like Alabama, it said that damages were to be measured by the cash contributions that the decedent had made to his family. And since most of the participants who had died, most of them were very poor, conventional damage measurements would have been de minimis. Or frankly, it might have been that Fred wanted control of the case. And it's important to know it was Fred's case, first and foremost. He was in charge of the litigation, and Mike and my role was to assist him. In any event, Mike recruited me to help, and those were days before fax machines and even FedEx. So we would work on papers here in New York, and I would get in a taxi cab out to LaGuardia and literally hand them to the pilots on the Delta airplane to fly down to Alabama, where they would be turned into proper papers at Fred's office. We had, if I may say so, we came up with a lot of creative legal theories, most importantly, perhaps, suing the individual researchers who had participated in this study. It had started in 1932 and been continued on through into the 1970s. And a study that, in retrospect and on investigation, had been filled with false pretenses. And so the question was whether or not you could ground constitutional torts claims against individuals based upon the then recently decided Bivens case, which authorized this kind of thing, and we tried to bring those kind of claims. We were before the great Southern judge Frank Johnson, a hero of the civil rights movement, and he basically didn't want to decide any of these complicated legal issues. Instead, he set a firm trial date. And that scared the hell out of everybody as to whether or not we were going to be able to organize a trial effectively. But it made clear to the government that settlement might be in its best interest. And that's when Mike took the starring role. As you can imagine, he was a great negotiator. He was a great intuitor of where other people's sensitive points might be when it came to getting them to write big checks, both donors to the university and, in this case, the United States government. And he saw that the public health authorities would be extremely reluctant to have the full story of the misconduct spread on the public page, let alone the impact it would have of having these now elderly men who obviously were in no situation to consent to being participants in a life-threatening research study. They wouldn't want that to happen. And so we batted back settlement proposals that Mike made. They were, of course, as you'd expect, rejected out of hand the first time. But by the third time, the government was more interested as that trial date grew closer. But the ultimate decision to settle was Fred, and through Fred the men, the amazing Frank Pollard, who was our lead plaintiff. They all consulted, and they decided that the amount of money on offer was something that they would take, particularly because they'd get it soon, and they were very elderly. And so the case settled. At the time, neither Mike nor I had any idea of how significant Tuskegee would be in terms of the national memory about research regulation and outrageous research done on unsuspecting minority populations. It was by no means the only such incident, but it's the one that is stuck in mind, that has produced plays, movies, music, et cetera, and it's become really a part of the American story. And as I say, Mike played a very big part in that. So with that, let me stop.
Our next speaker would have been Jane Ginsburg. As you know, an accomplished legal scholar, renowned authority in intellectual property, the Morton Janglo Professor. Of course, she's the daughter of two wonderful lawyers, Martin Ginsburg and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, both Columbia Law School professors, as we all know. Professor Ginsburg has two children, and being in the entertainment business, I promised that I would help promote them. One is a lawyer, of course, and her son, Paul Speier, is an actor. And he's going to be starring with Mel Gibson in a program entitled On the Line, to be released on Netflix this fall. And I told Jane when I introduce her, I'm certainly going to encourage everybody to watch it. So she thanked me very much for the promo. Unfortunately, I then get the following email yesterday. Dear George, you can't make this up. This afternoon I fell and broke my nose and my left ankle. I'm afraid I'm not in condition to be making a public appearance tomorrow when, according to the emergency room doctor, I will look like a victim of domestic violence. I am instead, she had her mother's wit, of course, I am instead attaching the remarks I would have given and request that one of the other participants read them in my stead. Apologies, Jane. So I thought it would be most appropriate that if I ask Pat to come up and read Jane's remarks. And as many of you know, very hard to capture Pat and Mike's relationship. Besides being married for over 25 years, they were friends, mentors, partners. I can't just describe the depth of their friendship, so you can guess that they really liked each other. And so it's my pleasure, Pat, if you would come up and please relate Jane's remarks.
I think I need these lower. Thank you, George. When my mother was aspiring to a tenure-track post at Columbia in the early 1960s, Mike's colleagues, but so far I know not Mike, who had recently joined the faculty, informed her that Rutgers wouldn't mind having a woman on its law faculty. But that was before Michael Sovern became my mother's employment agent. After he became dean, he corrected the school's misstep by hiring her away from Rutgers onto the Columbia Law faculty as its first woman tenured professor. Mike's role as impresario accelerated when in 1980, he urged Senator Edward Kennedy, then chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to confirm her appointment to the DC Circuit. His description, particularly the last clause, was spot on. I firmly believe she would make an outstanding appellate judge. She has the temperament, fair-mindedness, patience, and willingness to listen. She has the intelligence, oops, thank you. I just can't see my text here. She has the sorry, okay, I see now. She has the temperament, fair-mindedness, patience, and willingness to listen. She has the intelligence. She is brilliant, and she has the enormous capacity to work. 13 years later, Mike campaigned for my mother's nomination to the Supreme Court, writing to President Clinton, quote, Erwin Griswold, speaking at a Supreme Court anniversary celebration a few years ago, said that in modern times, two appellate advocates altered the nation's course. He named Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and he was right. Most importantly, according to my father, Mike enlisted Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, whose support may have proved decisive to President Clinton's choice. Mike wrote, Dear Pat, Ruth is the real thing. Any help you can give her would be a true service to court and country. Faithfully, Mike. Finally, I should mention Mike's role in my father's employment history. Mike was still dean of the law school when he persuaded my father to leave private practice to teach law at Columbia, to teach tax at Columbia, sorry. Tax and law. My father walked into the negotiation with a substantial wish list, knowing that he was dealing with one of the country's preeminent authorities on labor law. Asked how the discussion went, my father replied, quote, just fine. He gave me everything he had already decided I was going to get. Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker needs no introduction, Jerry Speier, who's devoted so much of his career to Columbia, to the business school, to the university, to Board of Trustees. And we departed a little bit by having a businessman instead of yet another lawyer. So please, Jerry.
It's hard to believe that we're all here and thinking about Mike Sovern, and he's not in the crowd, because nothing happened at Columbia that Mike didn't boost during his lifetime that occurred at Columbia. He was really unique. It's appropriate today that the mascot of Columbia is having its birthday. Its 119th birthday. I think Mike would have loved that. You know, he wasn't a great athlete. He liked to play tennis, but he wasn't a great athlete. He was great at everything else. He was really terrific. Whatever he touched was always perfect. Whether it was teaching a class, whether it was talking about political issues, or anything else, his touch was absolutely magnificent. One of the great things he did was to bring Herb Pardes to Columbia. Herb was the dean of the medical school during those days. He started out as a psychiatrist, and I guess it helped him as dean of the medical school. He brought so many people to Columbia. He was unique in his ability to draw great people around him. He had the facility to pick and choose unique people that were really talented. You know, I didn't go to the law school, but I knew many of the people at the law school, both students and professors. And I have to say, collectively, I never had the opportunity of meeting more intelligent, really brilliant people than I did when I met people from the law school. Mike's touch was always there. I suspect it's still there today, right, Dean? I think that Mike did so many things for Columbia that it's hard to really list them. So I thought I would focus my attention this afternoon on one miraculous thing that he did accomplish, which is in his book, and that was to right the ship. Columbia was in miserable, miserable financial condition when he became president. And yes, Mark Rudd did help with that calamity. But the fact of the matter is that there were a lot of things that contributed to that calamity. And so when Mike became president, it was pretty clear that the finances of the university had to be changed. We literally had pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters, probably no 50-cent pieces in the bank in those days. And the one great asset that the university owned was the land under Rockefeller Center. Now, some of you may not know this, but that land actually was contributed to the university by the Rockefeller family via the state. And when I became a trustee, I walked into the boardroom in Low Library and kind of looked around. I was given a seat. It was at one end of the table, and I was told that as you moved along in your term as trustee, you moved around the table. And I looked around, and I thought to myself, wow, there must be nobody in this room within 20 years of my age. So to say that I was scared to death, believe me, is an understatement. And as I sat through the first year of meetings at the Board of Trustees in that room, I kept on looking at the plants in the room and thinking to myself, I'm contributing about as much as those plants are contributing to this group of people. And I thought to myself, this really isn't good for the university. And I did love Columbia. I went to the college, I went to the business school, and I really didn't have any money in those days. And I thought to myself, I can't contribute here. I should get out of here and let them place somebody that is more consistent with the image of a trustee. And so I invited Mike to have lunch with me, and we had lunch in Midtown. And as we're having lunch, we both had hamburgers. He loved hamburgers, I love hamburgers. And we're chatting, and I finally get around to the topic at hand. I say to Mike, you know, nothing has honored me more than being asked to be a trustee of Columbia. I just feel so badly that I'm occupying a chair in the Board of Trustees room. It's inappropriate, and I really can't do what trustees should do. And he kind of looked at me, and he dropped his hamburger into his plate and splattered ketchup all over this white tablecloth. And there was kind of a second or two of silence between us. And he looked at me, he said, it's a good thing that wasn't blood. And I said, it's only ketchup. And he said, look, I'll make you a deal. And the deal is this. You stay for one more year, and if at the end of this year you're still feeling the way you are now, I'll give you a hug and say, good luck. I took the deal, and a couple of months went by. He called me in the office and said, I've got something really important to talk to you about. Can you come over for a drink later this week? I did, went up to his apartment, and he said, look. And he went on to say that David Rockefeller had called him and suggested that the university consider selling the property that it owned under Rockefeller Center to his family. And I guess, to make a long story short, Mike was very successful. And of course, from that point on, the story of Columbia's finances began to change. They changed a little bit, and obviously under Lee, they've changed a whole lot. But the fact of the matter is that at that moment in time, the destiny of this university really changed. And we were able to right the ship. During that year of negotiation to purchase the property, there were lots of conversations, and there were some good old boys from Texas that represented the Rockefeller family, and there were some tough bankers from Goldman Sachs. But despite all the back and forth, Mike just never wavered. He said, we have to make this deal. It's horrible to be in a position to have to make a deal. But the deal was done, and it was done at twice what we would have taken for the property. The fact of the matter is they paid us $400 million. We thought it was worth about $200. And that was Mike. Mike always won the argument. He was a mediator, he was a thinker, and despite the fact that he was an academic from head to toe, he was one hell of a businessman. And I have to say that in all the dealings that we had together, nothing was more fun than getting that check from the Rockefeller family for $400 million. Years went by, and our friendship continued long after I served the Board of Trustees. We went to concerts together, we went to theater together, and it was a whole lot of fun because he knew his theater, he knew how to critique a play in a way that most mortals really don't have the capability to do. And at a concert, he knew his music. He knew if the notes were right. He knew if the conductor was really getting the best from the orchestra. And Mike always knew how to get the best of the best. And he said to me any number of times, my Pat is the best, and no doubt about it. So thank you, Pat, for asking me to speak today. And thank you, Mike, for all you did for Columbia.
So, Pat, we have a conflict. They're telling me there's 15 minutes remaining, but I think Mike broke rules. So what I'd like to do, as Jerry mentioned, Mike's ability to find qualified people, before I introduce the Dean of the Law School to conclude this meaningful program. I was having breakfast with Mike years ago, and as everybody knows, he was a prodigious fundraiser. We're having lunch, and this was many years ago, and he said, somebody came to me and wanted to give me $8 million, which in those days was a lot of money, if I would appoint him as a member of the Board of Trustees. And Mike said, there was just something about it that I didn't feel comfortable with. And Mike said, I really love raising money because I love money. And he said, I'm just going to wait. And then over the weekend, Mike's favorite newspaper was the New York Post. the headline in the New York Post read, "Ivan Boesky indicted for insider trading." So I said, "Mike, that's very wise. It's a reflection of you being an ethical person and you weren't seduced by the money." I then said to him, "I have a suggestion. I think you should ask David Stern, the NBA commissioner, to be a trustee." And David had been a graduate of the law school, did very well, obviously was having a good career. And Mike looked at me and I said, "Mike, just understand this. If David could handle Michael Jordan and Larry Bird, he could handle you. So I want you to know this would be no problem." Mike got David on the board of trustees. David became chair of the board of trustees, and as my oldest and closest friend, gave me great pleasure to contribute to the success of Columbia. And without getting too emotional, it was very ironic because David passed away the same month that Mike passed away, and it's a loss to my family and everybody else. And to Pat, it was just a tough time for us. And it just reflects the fact of Michael's mastery, his ethical approach to life, and how he just loved Columbia. And Pat, you got to give me some guidance here. They shut off the monitor, so my question is, would you like some stories, or we just have the dean of the law school speak? Great. She needs no introduction, but I tried to get some personal information, and as a lawyer and dean, she was very guarded. So all I could really say is that you and Mike both specialized in labor law, and this is a lousy introduction, but go ahead.
Thank you, George. And let me also just take a moment to thank all of our panelists for a wonderful, very moving and evocative. Our memories are all stirred by the stories you've told from all these different parts of Mike's relationships with the university and with you. So thank you so much for those wonderful remarks. I also want to express our collective gratitude to Pat. You know, the pandemic slowed us down. We all wanted to be here gathering 2 years ago. But Pat never let go of the resolve and the vision for an opportunity for us to come together, both to collect scholarship around Mike and the kind of work that Mike did in a symposium, and also to think sensitively about how Mike would have wanted to be remembered in an event like the one we're having today. So, Pat, I hope you feel the depth and of affection and esteem that has come across today from the Columbia community. We remember your beloved Mike, our beloved Mike, and his collective embrace extends to your entire family. So, before we conclude the program, I hope you'll allow me to share a few of my own recollections, reflections on Mike. When I became dean of Columbia Law School in 2015, Mike had long since concluded his formal service in university leadership. But that didn't mean he withdrew from life in the law school, nor turned away from his natural skills as an ambassador. Quite the opposite. He saw it as part of his job to welcome me and my husband. Before we even set foot on the Columbia campus, Mike had reached out to me across the country to welcome me, to say hello. And as soon as we did arrive, Eric Talley, my husband, also a law school professor, and I really had been warmly welcomed by Mike. And in the years that followed, I enjoyed a warm friendship with Mike as colleague and as a fellow traveler. Mike's thoughtful insight and advice about deaning was always helpful, and it was always delivered with a sort of a velvet touch. Never overbearing. Sometimes I didn't even know that I had received advice until after the conversation was over. But the message always somehow managed to get through in a very skillful, really, really insightful way. And I have really nice memories of the four of us, Eric and Pat and Mike and I, enjoying evenings of theater, good conversation, always get 2 glasses of wine at the buffet after at the reception after the opening. Lessons learned about how to navigate the post-opening reception. And of course, all those years until he passed, Mike continued to be among the first teachers that new law students at Columbia Law School encountered when they entered our classrooms. As came through in Jane's remarks, he taught a section of legal methods, the staple course that every incoming Columbia Law student takes as part of their orientation. And these legal methods sections, each of which enrolls roughly a quarter of the incoming student body, become the basis for students to organize themselves and form community. So each August, there were nearly 100 law students who would proudly have a name tag displaying the name Sovern on their name tag. They're the Sovern section. They'd have it on their shirts or their backpacks. They'd ask their friends at the orientation, are you a Sovern? Are you a Sovern? And the dean of students would have a flag, and she said, Sovern's over here. So by virtue of this, Mike was much more than a name on a student's 1L transcript. He was an organizing principle and an identity that they would carry with them, that they would assume on that first day and carry with them through law school. They were Soverns. And that's going to carry with them, they're continuing to carry that with them, well past the time that they walked our halls. Reunions come and students gather again, and the Soverns find each other. They sit at a table together. We're Soverns. My last reflection is just to say how high a bar Mike set for future deans like me. Much has been said, and so I think it's already evident the ways in which the standard that Mike set was one that all of us as deans who followed him aspired to and looked to as a model. One of the most vital and challenging roles of a dean is to lead through periods of change. It's essential to the role is to find ways to lead a community through change, sometimes very difficult change. And in this, as many of these stories have made evident, Mike was a master. The sheer volume of firsts that occurred during Mike's deanship in the law school, some have been mentioned, the first woman to join the faculty, the first African-American person to join our faculty. There were many, many trails blazed during his time, not just in the law school, but beyond. So he led during a period of history that was in which the university was buffeted by explosive social forces. And what made him so successful in doing that? Well, I think what made him successful is that he leaned into the change. You know, he saw the change coming. He understood how challenging it would be. And he, through his own methods, sometimes very forceful and sometimes the velvet touch that I described earlier, he would lean into that change. And I really loved the way Hal talked about the faculty meeting, where somehow we ended up where Mike wanted us to be. So Mike moved mountains, but people didn't always quite see it, that how Mike had gotten them there. But he could have been stubborn. He could have resisted. He could have seen change with fear, and he didn't. He embraced it, he saw it, and he brought people along to changes that really defined the university, defined the law school and beyond, defined the university. And he elevated. In doing so, he elevated us all to achieve our highest ideals rather than resisting stubbornly what was to come. There's an old quip, often attributed to the poet W.H. Auden, in which a doctor asks a patient, and this is kind of a Mike-like joke, "Do you talk in your sleep?" And the patient answers, "No, but I talk in someone else's sleep. I'm a professor." I'm sure all of us here today have fond recollections of Mike, professor, dean, provost, president, leader. If a professor is the one who talks in someone else's sleep, these memories will live on in the lore of this great university, of course, but also, I suspect, so many of his sage lessons will appear in our dreams from time to time. The true embodiment of a professorial life well lived. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you to President Bollinger, to our panelists, to the Office of the President, to my law school colleagues for helping to organize this, and to Pat and the entire Sovern family. I hope you'll now join us for a cocktail reception that's on the 4th floor. So one floor above where we are now, just one floor up. And with that, thank you and good afternoon.
Well, I'm a one Jesus guy. This down on me.